Prince William had opened the boot expecting a security problem. What he found instead was his mother's voice, handwritten, private, untouched, since 1997 locked inside a case belonging to Queen Camilla's son sitting in a courtyard with no clearance and no explanation. In the space of 10 minutes on a Friday morning at Clarence House, a routine check became something the palace had no procedure for and no language to contain. Because the letters Diana left behind were not simply correspondence, they were a record. And someone had decided without authorization and without announcement that they needed to exist somewhere outside the archive that had held them sealed for nearly 30 years. Before we go any further, subscribe if you haven't already. Royal stories at this level of detail almost never surface completely. There are always layers the headlines don't reach. This channel goes there. What the courtyard revealed that morning was only the surface. To understand what was really inside that case and why its presence in that particular car on that particular morning was not an accident, we need to return to Diana herself. To the letters she wrote when she knew someone was listening, and to the one sentence she underlined just once in the final months before everything changed. It had begun like any other Friday at Clarence House, the kind of morning that does not announce itself. Staff moving through their routines with the quiet efficiency that palace life demands. A light breeze crossing the courtyard, the particular stillness of a building that has learned across generations how to hold its breath without anyone noticing it is doing so. And then, just before mid-morning, a black car pulled in near the private entrance. Unannounced, unscheduled, no prior clearance logged in the security system. The man who noticed it first was Sergeant Whitmore. He had been with the royal household for more than a decade, and I want you to think carefully about what that actually means because it is the hinge of this entire story. A man like that knows the plates of every vehicle that makes a regular visit. He knows what a car looks like when it is carrying nothing unusual. He knows without being able to fully explain how the difference between an ordinary morning and one that is about to stop being ordinary. He walked a slow circle around the car, and within seconds he knew something was off. The boot sat lower than it should have, not dramatically, not in any way that would have alarmed a less experienced officer, just enough, the kind of detail that lives in the gap between what you can prove and what you simply know. He called another guard over, quietly, no urgency in his voice because he had learned across more than a decade in that courtyard that the second you show urgency in a place like this, you have already changed the atmosphere. And the staff nearby began to slow down without quite knowing why. The morning, which had been moving at its usual pace, started almost to hold its breath. Inside, none of this had reached Tom Parker Bowles yet. He was sitting with his mother in her private drawing room talking about food. A chef he had recently spent time with in Paris, some unusual technique that had made him laugh. Camilla was leaning in, listening. These visits mattered to her in a way that formal engagements never quite could because Tom had never been a working royal. He had built his life deliberately at a distance from all of this. His own career, his own voice, his own identity shaped entirely outside the institution his mother now sat at the center of. When he came to Clarence House, he came as a son, not as a figure attached to a crown. Hold on to that, because it is what makes everything that follows so difficult to resolve cleanly. Whitmore knocked softly on the car window. No response. He walked inside and asked to speak with the visitor. Tom came out into the courtyard with the mild, slightly puzzled expression of a man who believes this is a formality. Something to be cleared up in 2 minutes so he can go back to his mother and the conversation about Paris. He was wrong about that, completely wrong. And you can see almost the exact second he understands it. Because when Whitmore pointed to the boot and explained that a routine check was required, something shifted in Tom's face. He said the case inside was personal and private. Books and papers, nothing more. He would prefer it not be opened. And here is the problem with that, and it is worth saying plainly. In the royal household, preference is not protocol. Whitmore held his position without backing down and without escalating. He simply held. By the time Camilla stepped outside, a small audience had gathered in the courtyard. Not a crowd. Enough! People who worked in that building and understood from the shape of the scene alone that something had moved outside the ordinary. Her voice, sources say, was sharper than usual. Whitmore explained calmly and respectfully without retreating an inch. And then a second car entered the courtyard. Prince William stepped out. Whether that was coincidence or whether someone inside the building had already made a call, that question matters more than it first appears, and we will come back to it. But watch what happens to the courtyard the instant he appears. The guards straighten. Tom's jaw tightens. Camilla goes still in the particular way of someone who has spent decades managing their own stillness. William takes it all in, the car, the case, the guards, his stepmother, her son. He says nothing for a moment. He just reads the scene the way a man reads a room when he has been trained his entire life to understand what rooms are really saying. Then he gives one instruction, quiet, clear, not negotiable. Open the boot. And what he saw inside stopped everyone present from making a sound, because this was not a security breach in any ordinary sense. This was something his training had never prepared him for. Something that had nothing to do with protocol and everything to do with a wound that had been traveling toward this courtyard for nearly 30 years. William did not speak on the drive back to Kensington Palace. His aide in the front seat understood enough not to fill the silence. The case sat secured in the boot, the same case that less than an hour earlier had been in Tom Parker Bowles' car, with no explanation, no clearance, and no answer that had satisfied anyone in that courtyard. William had given his instructions clearly before leaving Clarence House. The case would be transferred under his authority. No copies made, no further questions asked in any public forum. Whatever came next would happen behind a closed door. He carried it in himself. He asked his staff to leave, all of them, and the sitting room at Kensington Palace went quiet, in the way a room only goes quiet when the person left inside it is holding something too heavy to put down. He set the case on the table. He sat across from it for a long moment, and then he opened it. What was inside had been arranged with care. Stacked pages wrapped in tissue layered neatly, leather-bound diaries beneath them, their covers worn soft with age in the way that objects go soft when they have been held often and held carefully. And at the very bottom, 2 sealed envelopes, each marked in the same hand. William recognized that handwriting the instant the boot had opened in the courtyard. He recognized it again now in the silence with no one watching. The bold curves, the quick, slightly slanted letters, the way certain words pressed harder into the page as though the person writing them needed the paper to hold what they were saying, needed some physical object to bear the weight of it. His mother had written like that when something mattered, and what he was looking at now was a case full of things that had mattered very much. These were Diana's letters, her private diaries, her own words in her own hand written in the years before her death in August of 1997, locked in storage since the morning the world found out she was gone. And now, sitting on a table in his private sitting room at Kensington Palace, which had once been her home too, carried here in the boot of a car with no explanation he had yet been able to make complete sense of. Stop and think about what that means for a moment, because it reframes the entire courtyard scene in a way that is almost impossible to absorb cleanly. This was not contraband. This was not money or contracts or anything you could assign a simple label to. This was the interior voice of the woman William lost when he was 15 years old, sitting in a courtyard with no announcement and no authorization. And he had been required to open it in front of Camilla and Tom to find that out. The whiplash of that, expecting a security problem and finding instead the handwriting of your dead mother, is almost impossible to fully articulate. He lifted the first letter carefully. The date placed it in 1995, which he understood without being told had been one of the most painful years of her life. The words were not formal. They were not written for an audience or an archive or anyone who might one day hold them up to the light and read what was inside. They were the words of a woman writing to herself, the way people write only when they genuinely believe no one else will ever read it. She wrote about feeling watched, about phone calls that seemed listened to, about a marriage that had ended in every meaningful sense long before the world was ever told, about loneliness that lived in rooms full of people, about the particular exhaustion of performing composure for an institution that had very little interest in how much composure cost. And she wrote about Camilla. Not with rage, not with the anger that might have been easier to encounter. She wrote about her with the quiet resignation of someone who had long since stopped fighting something and simply started recording it instead. The tone was not bitter. It was something quieter and considerably harder to carry a woman who had already decided that what she felt was simply the truth, and that the truth did not require decoration. William sat with that for a long time, then he opened the diary. He did not read far. A few pages in, he stopped. An entry from the months before the accident in Paris. The handwriting here was faster, more urgent, as though the thoughts were arriving faster than the hand could keep pace. She wrote about meetings that had never been officially recorded, about people she did not fully name, and then at the bottom of the page, almost as an afterthought or perhaps the exact opposite of an afterthought, a single sentence underlined once. He closed the diary. He did not open it again that night. He sat in the lamplight until the room outside his window went completely dark. And the question that followed him out of that silence and into every room he walked into across the next 6 weeks was one he had not yet found a way to ask aloud. To understand why that diary entry did not read to William as paranoia, you have to understand what Diana had already put on paper before it. Because the sentence he read alone that night, underlined once in the handwriting that pressed hardest when something mattered most, was not the first time she had written something like it. It was the last in a sequence that had been building carefully and with increasing specificity across the final 2 years of her life. And every document in that sequence had in one way or another been locked away, sealed in a safe, or kept hidden for years after her death. On the 30th of October, 1995, Diana sat down with her solicitor, Victor Mishcon, at a private meeting that was never intended to become part of any official record. She told him that reliable sources, people she trusted but would not name, had warned her that efforts were being made to remove her. A staged car accident, she said, a brake failure, an injury serious enough to have her declared unstable and therefore no longer relevant to the public life of the monarchy. Mishcon transcribed what she told him in careful, measured notes. He took it seriously because she was serious, and because even then, even in the room, the specificity of what she was describing was not the language of someone in the grip of unfounded fear. It was the language of someone who had been given information and was attempting to process it responsibly. When Diana died in Paris in the early hours of the 31st of August, 1997, Mishcon handed those notes to Metropolitan Police Commissioner Sir Paul Condon within weeks. What happened next is its own kind of story. The note was placed in a safe. It remained there for 6 years. It did not surface publicly until 2003, when it was passed to the coroner leading Diana's inquest. And by then, nearly every person who had been in the room the night she described the threat had spent years believing the conversation would remain entirely private. That was the Mishcon note, but it was not the only document. In October of 1996, 2 months after her divorce from Charles had been finalized, and less than a year before the night in the Paris tunnel, Diana wrote a letter by hand to her butler, Paul Burrell. She sealed it in an envelope. She wrote Paul on the outside. She handed it to him and said, "I am going to date this and I want you to keep it, just in case." What was inside that envelope described in Diana's own words what she believed was being planned. Someone she did not name who was arranging an accident in her car, brake failure, serious head injury. The purpose, as she understood it, was to clear the path for Charles to marry without the complication of her continued public presence. She described herself as in the most dangerous phase of her life. Burrell kept the letter secret for 6 years. He revealed it in 2003 in his memoir. By that point, the world had already watched 10 years of inquests, investigations, and public hearings attempt to establish what had actually happened in the Alma Tunnel. Diana's letter did not resolve any of those questions, but it established something that mattered in a different way entirely. She had seen it coming. She had written it down, and she had handed the paper to someone she trusted, asking him to hold it in case something happened. These were not the words of a woman being irrational. They were the words of a woman creating a record because she understood that institutions prefer their silences uninterrupted and that a woman who insisted on speaking inconveniently had very little protection beyond her own written testimony. William knew all of this history. He had grown up inside the aftermath of it. He had sat through the inquests, read the reports, listened to the arguments about what the evidence did and did not prove. He understood the Mishcon note and the Burrell letter as contested documents, as material that serious people had examined seriously and reached no definitive conclusions from. But sitting alone in his private sitting room at Kensington Palace, holding his mother's diary, reading a sentence she had underlined, once he was not reading it as a contested document. He was reading it as her son. And as her son, he understood something the formal inquiries never quite could, that this was not a departure from the way Diana thought. It was entirely consistent with it. The sentence in the diary was not an anomaly. It was the end of a line she had been drawing for 2 years in letter after letter, document after document, each one pressed harder into the page than the last. And the question that followed him out of that sitting room, the one that would not let him rest for 6 weeks, was not whether his mother had been right to fear what she feared. The question was, who else had read those words before tonight, and what they had decided to do with them. It did not begin with a confrontation. It did not begin with a decision made in anger or a plan drawn up in a back room or any of the dramatic mechanisms that royal scandals are usually assumed to require. It began with dinner, a private address, a quiet evening, no official record because it was never intended to be official. Camilla had gathered her children, Tom and his sister Laura, for the kind of meal that exists entirely outside the formal machinery of palace life. Good food, easy conversation, the particular warmth of a family that has learned across years of navigating an unusual situation how to be simply themselves when the institution is not watching. And at some point in the evening, Camilla mentioned something in the tone people use for things they consider completely settled. The royal archivists, she said, were in the middle of a significant cataloging project. Personal correspondence and private papers belonging to Diana, items that had been held in storage since 1997, were being formally reviewed and logged for the first time. Purely administrative, she said. A long overdue tidying of a record that had been sitting untouched for nearly 3 decades. Tom asked one question, a small one. The kind that sounds like idle curiosity at a dinner table and sometimes genuinely is. He wanted to know what would happen to the letters once they were logged, whether they would stay sealed, whether anyone outside the archival team would have access to them. Camilla's answer was brief. The items would be stored securely. They would not be made public. And she moved the conversation elsewhere. The evening went on. Laura laughed at something. Somebody refilled a glass. And that was all. On its own, that exchange is nothing. A son asking a reasonable question at his mother's dinner table. A mother giving a reasonable answer. The conversation moves on, the evening ends, and nobody in that room has done anything that could be described as consequential. But keep it in your pocket, because in a story built the way this one is built, the small questions are never as idle as they look. And what happened in the weeks that followed that dinner is the mechanism by which an idle question at a private table becomes a case sitting in a courtyard, with no clearance and no explanation. 3 weeks after that evening, a member of the Clarence House household staff was quietly reassigned. Reassignments happen constantly inside royal households. Staff move between roles, between residences, between departments for reasons that are rarely explained and even more rarely questioned. It is a structural feature of palace life, and it creates, entirely by design, a kind of built-in institutional fog. Things change, people move, the household simply continues. Nobody is required to explain the ordinary business of administration to anyone who does not need to know. But here is what made this particular reassignment matter. The person who was moved had been responsible for coordinating access requests to the archival review, scheduling visits, logging checkouts, ensuring that every single item that left the collection was recorded and that every item returned was matched against the original log. The entire oversight process for a collection of royal correspondence that had not been examined in 30 years ran through this one role, and when that person was reassigned, the role was not immediately filled. There was a gap 11 days, according to sources familiar with the internal timeline, during which the formal oversight of archival access had no dedicated coordinator at all. Requests were still being processed. Items were still being checked out. But the one person whose entire function was to catch inconsistencies was no longer in the building. And what the access log would later show once someone finally reviewed it in full was this: an item checked out during that 11-day window under a valid standing authorization code cataloged simply as personal correspondence, miscellaneous pre-2000. No return entry filed, no follow-up initiated, no flag triggered. Because the code was legitimate, the process had been followed correctly in every formal sense. On paper, everything looked exactly as it was supposed to look. And I want you to sit with that for a moment. Because this is the whole mechanism of the story. This is precisely how the most consequential things move, not through dramatic theft, not through broken locks or forced entry, but through a gap that exists for 11 days in an administrative process that nobody thought to question because it had always functioned correctly before. The dinner had been 6 months before the courtyard. The question Tom asked had taken approximately 3 seconds, and between those 2 moments something had moved through a gap that nobody had thought to close, carrying the private words of a dead woman out into a world she had not trusted to hold them. The security review was commissioned within 48 hours of the courtyard. It was the first formal examination of the archival access system in more than a decade, and the people tasked with conducting it understood from the moment the brief landed on their desks that the standard pace of institutional review was not going to be adequate here. This was not the kind of inquiry that could afford to move slowly. What they found when they examined the access log in full was considerably more than anyone had prepared for. Not one missing entry, three separate instances across a 4-month period in which items had been checked out of the Diana correspondence collection under the same standing authorization code, each one cataloged identically personal correspondence, miscellaneous pre-2000. Each one with no return entry, no follow-up, no acknowledgement in the formal record that anything had left the collection and not come back. The code itself was not unusual. It had been created during the administrative transition that followed Charles's accession, a period in which dozens of such codes were generated, assigned, and filed with very little individual scrutiny because the sheer volume of work in those months made careful scrutiny of each one difficult to sustain. The code had been used correctly by every formal measure the system possessed. It had never previously triggered a flag of any kind. So the review team did the next logical thing. They cross-referenced that code against the household staff register. And here is the finding that turns the entire shape of the story. The code did not belong to Tom Parker Bowles. Tom had no archival access. He had never had archival access. He was not a working royal. He held no position in the formal household structure that would have entitled him to request materials from a protected royal collection under any circumstances whatsoever. He could not have checked those items out. The system would not have permitted it. He was not even on the list of people the system would have considered. The code belonged to a member of Camilla's personal household staff, a senior member. Someone whose access level reflected not a recent appointment but years of accumulated service, years of demonstrated reliability, years of being trusted with the kind of internal responsibility that only accrues to people who have earned it slowly and carefully over a long period of time. William read that preliminary finding alone in his private office at Kensington Palace. He read it twice in the same way he had read Tom's transcript, once for the confirmed facts and once for what the confirmed facts implied. What they implied was this: Tom Parker Bowles had not taken Diana's letters from the archive. He had received them, which means the question that had been shaping itself since the courtyard, how had the items been removed, and by whom, was now a different question entirely. The how was no longer mysterious. 3 withdrawals, 1 code, an 11-day gap in oversight. The mechanism was legible. What was not yet legible was the direction in which the mechanism had been pointed. Someone inside Camilla's personal household had used a valid authorization code to remove Diana's correspondence from a protected royal collection on 3 separate occasions across 4 months. And Tom had been in possession of a case containing those items when his car arrived unannounced in a courtyard where it was never supposed to be. Tom did not have the keys. He could never have had the keys. He was not inside the door. Which meant the story that had been quietly forming in the minds of everyone who had watched the courtyard scene, the story in which Tom Parker Bowles was the architect, the decision-maker. The person at the center of this was wrong, not partially wrong, structurally wrong. He was not the one who had loaded the case. He was the last visible link in a chain that ran backward past him, past his car, past the gate of Clarence House, and into a household he did not formally belong to in any capacity at all. And somewhere inside that chain, a person who had spent years earning a position of real internal trust had made a decision on 3 separate occasions across 4 months to use that trust in a direction nobody inside that building had authorized. The review team noted the finding carefully. The summary was drafted with the precision of people who understood that the document they were producing would be read by a king. And William set it down and sat with what it meant. Because identifying the mechanism was one thing, understanding who had aimed it and toward what end was something considerably more difficult. And that was the question he was going to have to take into a room with Camilla and ask without a document in his hand. The formal questioning took place the same afternoon as the courtyard. Not at a police station, not on record in any public sense. A discreet office at Clarence House, the kind of room that exists precisely for situations the palace needs documented but not disclosed. Two royal legal officers, one aide taking notes in the corner quietly enough that a person who was not paying attention might almost forget she was there. The furniture chosen, like all furniture in rooms like that one, for function over comfort. The kind of space designed to make the ordinary business of accountability feel manageable without making it feel easy. Tom arrived without a solicitor. That detail tells its own story before a single word is exchanged. A man who arrives at a formal questioning inside the royal household in the aftermath of the morning that had just passed without legal representation is a man who has already made a decision about what kind of conversation this is going to be. Whether that decision was strategic or whether it was something simpler, something closer to the instinct of a person who has decided that what they are doing is right and does not need a lawyer to make it defensible is not a question. Anyone in that room could have answered with confidence. The officers were measured and professional. They began where all good questioning begins, with the straightforward. Was the case his? Yes. Were the items in his possession when he arrived at Clarence House? Yes. Had he declined to open it when security requested him to? Yes. 3 questions, 3 plain answers, no hesitation and no elaboration. And then the one that mattered. Where had the items come from? Tom looked at the table, not at the officers, not at the aide in the corner. He did not look at the window or the door or any of the other surfaces a person looks at when they are genuinely searching for an answer. He looked at the table with the specific quality of stillness that belongs to someone who has already decided exactly what they are going to say and is simply taking a moment before saying it. And then quietly, with what sources who were briefed on the exchange describe as deliberate composure, not the composure of someone who is calm, but the composure of someone who has chosen to be calm. Regardless of what they feel, he said the items had been hidden away for a long time. Someone needed to have them. He was not prepared to say anything further. Then he stopped talking. The officers waited. The room held its silence for longer than was comfortable. The aide in the corner did not move, and Tom did not fill the space. He simply sat with it in the way people sit, with silences they have decided in advance are going to be theirs to keep. Now here is the part that most tellings of this story move past without stopping, and I think it is the key to understanding everything that follows. Silence in a room like that one is not the absence of an answer. It is an answer. When a person refuses to respond to a direct question in a formal documented setting, the people in the room do not experience a blank space. They experience the refusal itself, and they fill it automatically with the most plausible explanation available to them. A silence in a legal context carries a specific weight. It becomes a statement, not a denial, not a confession. Something more durable than either, precisely because it cannot be retracted, cannot be clarified, and sits in the record permanently and exactly as it was given. What Tom Parker Bowles said in that room amounted to almost nothing. 3 words that acknowledged a situation without explaining it, followed by a deliberate and sustained refusal to say more. What the officers heard and what the aide in the corner wrote down was considerably more than nothing. William read the transcript an hour later in his private office. He read it once for the confirmed facts. Then he read it again more slowly, going back to the exchange. At the center, the question about where the items had come from, the answer that was not quite an answer, the silence that followed, and the single sentence that sat just before the silence, the one he kept returning to. Someone needed to have them. Not I needed to have them, not I took them, not I found them. Someone needed to have them, a construction that places the decision outside Tom himself, assigns it to an unnamed person whose judgment he appears to be honoring without being willing to name them, and leaves every possible door open while appearing to walk through none. Tom had not explained the mechanism, had not named a single other person, had not said a word that could be directly used against anyone, including himself. But in choosing not to name anyone, he had left a door open, and William had already started walking through it. William did not go through the formal scheduling process. He did not have an aide call Clarence House to find a mutually convenient time, did not route the request through the usual channels that palace life uses to place a layer of institutional distance between people who need to speak directly to one another. He sent the request himself, a brief message, personal in tone rather than procedural in structure, asking for a private meeting at Camilla's earliest availability. No explanation was offered, none was needed. Both of them understood what the meeting was going to be about before a single word of it had been spoken. Camilla replied within the hour she would see him that afternoon. They met in a small sitting room on the ground floor of Clarence House, no aides present, no note-taker in the corner, no document on the table between them, and no recording of any kind. Whatever passed between them in that room would stay there, held only by the two people who had been inside it, and that William had decided in advance was exactly the condition under which this conversation needed to happen. Sources close to both households describe what followed as short under 15 minutes and completely without anger, which is, when you think about it carefully, the most telling detail of everything. Because anger would have been easier. Anger has a shape, a duration, a natural beginning and a recognizable end. It can be expressed and then set aside. It can be responded to, managed, absorbed. What filled that room instead was something quieter and considerably harder to resolve: the particular weight of a conversation between two people who understand each other well enough to know that neither of them is going to say everything they know, and that both of them are going to have to live with that. Here is the choice William made that I think reveals more about him than almost anything else in this story. He did not present the access log. He did not lay the review team's preliminary findings on the table between them. He did not walk Camilla through the 3 withdrawal entries or the authorization code or the name of the senior household staff member to whom that code was registered. He had all of that. He had read it. He had read it twice. He chose not to use it. Not yet, not in this room, because what he wanted from this meeting was not a legal reckoning, and a document on a table between two people turns a conversation into a proceeding. It creates positions. It forces denials or confirmations that then have to be managed institutionally. It changes the nature of what is being asked and what can honestly be answered. What William wanted was simpler and considerably harder to obtain than any legal outcome. He wanted to ask one question directly, without intermediaries, without the procedural distance that institutions build between people, when the truth they are approaching is one that the institution would prefer to approach slowly. He asked her whether she had known. Camilla did not answer immediately. She looked at him for a moment, the particular look of someone who is not deciding how much to say, but how to say precisely what they have already decided to say. There is a difference between those two things, and it is not a small one. Her answer, when it came, was not a denial. It was something considerably more careful than a denial, and considerably more difficult to respond to. She told him she had known the letters existed, that she had known they had been recovered from storage during the cataloging project, that she had believed and continued to believe right up until the morning in the courtyard that they would remain where they were, private, secured, inaccessible to anyone outside the archival team. Whether she had directed anyone to remove them from the archive, she did not say. Whether she had known they were in Tom's possession, she did not say. And the space between what she confirmed and what she left unconfirmed was precisely the exact width of the question William most needed answered. It is worth pausing on that, because it is such a carefully constructed response. She did not lie. She confirmed what could reasonably be confirmed, and she declined with the composed deliberateness of a woman who has spent decades navigating rooms that required exactly this kind of precision to close the one gap that mattered most. William sat with her answer for a long moment. Then he told her what would happen next. The review findings would go to the king. The procedural reforms already underway would be completed and formally documented. The Crown's integrity on archival matters could not be seen to make exceptions regardless of who was involved. He said all of it without raising his voice, without accusation, in the tone of a man stating institutional facts because stating them was the only thing still available to him. Camilla made one request, that Tom be kept as far from the formal process as possible. William said he would do what he could. Both of them understood the limits of that. They left the room separately, and neither of them across the entire 15 minutes said Diana's name aloud. The whole conversation had orbited a woman neither of them could bring themselves to name. And that perhaps more than anything else in that sitting room tells you everything about what this really cost. The moment the door of that sitting room closed, what had been private began almost immediately to stop being private. It started as these things so often start inside the world of British royal journalism, with a phone call. A reporter from one of the major national newspapers contacted the palace press office late on the 4th evening after the courtyard. The question he asked was specific, precise enough in its detailed archival access procedures. Clarence House security protocols, a review recently commissioned to confirm without any room for doubt that someone on the inside had been talking. Not carelessly, not through the kind of accidental disclosure that happens when people process difficult events in the company of people they trust too readily. With the kind of deliberate, calibrated specificity that belongs to a person who knows exactly what they are releasing and has made a considered decision about exactly how much they are choosing to hold back. This was information being offered at a particular angle shaped to produce a particular kind of question in the mind of the person receiving it. The Palace Press Office gave its standard response, measured language, neither confirming nor denying the specific details raised, the kind of answer designed to close a conversation that in practice almost always does the opposite. By the following morning, the story had appeared. Not the front page, page 4. A single column carefully sourced describing questions that had arisen around archival access procedures at Clarence House following a recent internal security review. No names beyond the institution itself, no specific allegations, and no individual identified. Small enough in theory to be overlooked, specific enough in practice to be impossible for anyone watching the situation closely to dismiss. Within 12 hours, the royal correspondents were on camera. Not with facts, facts were still scarce, still contained within the walls of both households, but with questions. And the public did what the public has always done when a royal story arrives with its most important details deliberately absent. It filled the gaps automatically, immediately. In the direction of the most dramatic explanation the available information would support. The conversation divided itself as conversations about the royal family under pressure reliably do into distinct camps. The first read the story as institutional failure, an archival system that had proven inadequate to the task of protecting materials of profound historical and personal sensitivity. An oversight structure that had produced an 11-day gap large enough for items to disappear through without triggering a single automatic flag. The kind of administrative failure that happens not because anyone intended harm, but because institutions, when they move quickly through periods of transition, leave gaps they do not always notice until something has moved through them. The second camp read it as something more deliberate. Someone inside Camilla's circle had made a decision. Diana's private words had been moved, and the palace's response had been to manage the revelation rather than honestly confront what the revelation revealed. This camp was not interested in administrative failures. It was interested in intent. And then there was a third camp, quieter than the other two, and in some ways more unsettling than either. This camp did not particularly care who had taken the letters or by what mechanism they had traveled from the archive to the boot of a car in a Clarence House courtyard. What they wanted to know was what was in them. What Diana had written in her own hand in the years before her death that someone had considered worth the enormous risk of removing from a protected royal collection. What words pressed hard into pages by a woman writing for no audience had been judged too dangerous to leave undisturbed. That question, and not the access log, and not the administrative gap, and not the name of the staff member whose code had appeared 3 times in a record of missing correspondence, was the question that gave the entire story its gravity. Because it placed Diana herself back at the center of a narrative that had spent nearly 30 years attempting to absorb and contain her, and it did so in a way that no institutional response could fully manage. Her presence was in the story now. It had entered through the side door that private letters always enter through once they stop being private, and it was not going to leave. International coverage followed within a day. Publications that rarely concerned themselves with the internal workings of the British monarchy ran editorials. The image that circulated most widely across those editorials was not a photograph from the courtyard. It was a file image of Diana's handwriting reproduced from a publicly available letter, legally without complication, and it needed no caption. Her handwriting needed no explanation. The world had spent 30 years looking at it, reading it, learning its particular character. The bold curves, the slightly slanted letters, the places where the pen had pressed harder. William watched all of it from Kensington Palace and said nothing publicly. His schedule was unchanged. He attended 2 engagements that week and smiled in every photograph taken at both. And the silence by that point was doing exactly what silence in these situations has always done. It was speaking for him, and it was saying considerably more than any statement his press office could have drafted. 4 days after the coverage broke, the royal family appeared together in public for the first time since the morning in the courtyard. A scheduled garden party at Buckingham Palace. One of those fixed points on the royal calendar, a summer fixture so embedded in the institutional rhythm of the monarchy that canceling it would have generated its own separate headline, its own separate set of questions, its own story running parallel to the one already in every notebook in London. The decision to proceed as planned was therefore itself a decision, a deliberate one. In royal life, there is no such thing as simply showing up. Every appearance is a statement. Every absence is a statement. The only variable is which kind of statement you are choosing to make. And if you knew what to look for that afternoon, if you had spent the previous 4 days following this story closely enough to understand the geometry of what had shifted, the whole thing was written in the physical arrangement of the afternoon itself. Charles arrived first. Camilla beside him, as she always was at events of this scale, moving with the practiced ease of a woman who has spent decades learning to make public appearances look effortless regardless of what the private hours before them contained, then arriving separately from a different entrance point on the opposite side of the garden, William and Catherine. The two couples moved through the same space across the entire duration of the afternoon. They greeted the same guests, accepted the same expressions of warmth and courtesy, were photographed by the same cameras positioned at the same angles, and they never once across 2 full hours appeared side by side. This is the kind of thing that requires coordination. Not the coordination of a plan drawn up in a meeting room and distributed as a briefing document. The subtler, more difficult coordination of 2 sets of people who understand each other well enough to move through a shared space in a particular way without ever needing to discuss it explicitly. The route that runs parallel to rather than alongside. The timing that ensures the same frame never contains both couples at the same moment. Any individual photograph taken that afternoon showed the royal family functioning exactly as expected. Composed, engaged, present. The image of an institution performing its duties with the competence and continuity it has spent centuries cultivating. It was only in the sequence, in the accumulated record of who stood where with whom, at what point in the afternoon, that the shift became visible. And the correspondents who had spent 4 days on this story had come to that garden party looking precisely for that kind of sequence. They found it. And they noted it with the careful, precise language of people who have learned that what they cannot say directly they can describe exactly. Tom Parker Bowles was not there. This carried no formal significance at an event of that scale. Garden parties at Buckingham Palace do not routinely include non-working relatives. His absence required no explanation and warranted no announcement. But his name was in every notebook in that garden, and his absence was noted by at least 3 correspondents who understood that in a story built around what is missing, everything missing acquires a significance it would not otherwise carry. There were 2 small moments that no camera captured, but that everyone who needed to know about them heard within hours. On one side of the garden, Camilla paused in the receiving line beside a man who had spent 4 decades inside the royal household, a former private secretary who had helped design the very archival protocols now under review and who understood the internal structure of palace record-keeping with the quiet authority of someone who had built parts of it himself. The exchange lasted perhaps 40 seconds. She smiled. He bowed with the precise depth that decades of institutional practice had made automatic. Whatever passed between them was inaudible to everyone standing nearby, which meant it was available to everyone watching as an image that carried no caption and therefore the most interpretable kind of image there is. On the opposite side of the garden, a guest asked William what he had been reading lately. The kind of light, uncomplicated social question that garden parties are specifically designed to produce. The kind you answer easily, warmly, in the register of pleasant conversation between people who have nothing more complicated than an afternoon between them. William answered without hesitation, with the unhurried composure of a man who had decided well in advance exactly how he was going to move through every moment of this particular afternoon. He said one word: letters. Then he smiled, turned slightly in the practiced way of someone managing a receiving line, and moved on to the next guest. 5 seconds. Nobody photographed it. The moment left no record of any kind, except that the aide standing 2 steps behind him heard it, and the correspondent positioned 4 steps to his left heard it too, and both of them understood without needing it to explain that nothing William had said that afternoon had been accidental. What the cameras could not capture was already written. And what was written, everyone in that garden already knew was only the visible surface of something that ran considerably deeper. The archival security review concluded 6 weeks after the morning in the courtyard. Its findings were not made public. There was no press release, no statement from the palace communications office, no summary document circulated beyond the tightly controlled group of people who had been present at every stage of the process, the King William and the relevant household principals on both sides of the equation. The same tight, deliberate circulation that had governed every decision since the moment Sergeant Whitmore walked a slow circle around a black car and noticed the boot sat too low. 3 procedural reforms were implemented as a direct result of what the review found. The standing authorization code system was retired entirely. The codes that had been created in volume during the administrative transition following Charles's accession, dozens of them assigned quickly in a period when scrutiny of each individual code was difficult to sustain, were revoked and replaced with a new access structure requiring individual verification for every request regardless of the seniority of the person making it. Access to pre-accession archival material now requires dual sign-off from 2 independent household officers, not one. Not a single senior member of staff whose years of service had established a position of trust sufficient to authorize a withdrawal unilaterally. 2 people operating independently, each required to confirm that what is being requested has been properly authorized by the appropriate authority before a single item leaves the collection. And the coordinator role, the position that had been vacant for 11 days, when the most consequential gap in the oversight process had opened, was formally created as a permanent post with its own dedicated reporting line and its own layer of institutional accountability, making the conditions that had allowed 3 withdrawals to pass unnoticed structurally impossible to recreate. They had closed the hole 6 weeks after the courtyard, after it had already been used 3 times. Tom Parker Bowles was not charged. No formal criminal process was initiated against him, and no public statement was ever made explaining why. The decision reached by William in careful consultation with palace legal counsel, communicated to the king before it was finalized and accepted by both of them with the particular weariness of people who understand that the right outcome and the just outcome are not always the same thing, reflected the impossible arithmetic the lawyers had identified from the very beginning. Pursuing Tom formally meant attaching a criminal process to the name of Camilla's son. However that process ended acquittal, conviction, or anything in between, it would attach itself to her name permanently. It would become part of how the public understood her part of the narrative that followed the monarchy into every difficult conversation about its own credibility for years. But declining to pursue him meant the Crown had applied its own rules selectively, had decided that the same protocols that would have been enforced rigorously against anyone outside this particular circle of proximity would bend quietly and without announcement around the people closest to the throne. And in the current climate, selective enforcement was a story that wrote itself in exactly the direction the institution could least afford. Both paths arrived at the same destination. Neither was acceptable. And the decision that was made, containment reform, no formal charges, was the one that satisfied no principle completely while managing the consequences of all of them simultaneously. Whether that was justice is a question the decision deliberately did not answer. It was not designed to answer it. It was designed to allow the institution to continue. Camilla continued in her role. Her public schedule proceeded unchanged across the weeks and months that followed. Every engagement attended, every duty fulfilled, every photograph showing a woman who has spent the better part of 3 decades navigating the distance between who the public believes her to be and who she understands herself to be, and who learned across all of those decades to make that distance invisible. Those who worked closely with both households describe a quiet recalibration in the months that followed. Fewer joint briefings between Clarence House and Kensington Palace, slightly longer response times on shared scheduling. Nothing that would ever appear in a headline, nothing that could be pointed to as evidence of rupture. Everything that would shape the texture of a working relationship for years, accumulating in the background of public appearances and shared duties and the ordinary business of an institution that does not have the option of stopping. And then there is the detail that I keep returning to. The one that out of everything in this entire story tells you most clearly what this was really about for William. Not the procedural reforms, not the legal arithmetic, not the 15 minutes in the sitting room at Clarence House. He kept Diana's letters. They were not transferred to the royal collection, not formally accessioned into any archival system, not logged, cataloged, or filed under any code in any household register. They stayed where he had placed them the night he read them alone in the lamplight in the secure safe in his private sitting room at Kensington Palace. The same building where she had once sat at a writing desk, pressing a pen hard into paper, writing words she intended for no one but herself. He never explained that decision publicly. He was never asked about it directly in any forum that required an answer. Those close to him suggest only that he was not ready to hand them back to the institution she had spent the last years of her life documenting her distrust of. They were her private words, and for now they would stay private. Think about what that means for a moment. Really think about it. He could not get justice, not cleanly, not in any form that satisfied the weight of what he had read alone in that room on a Friday night, holding pages his mother had written for no audience in the handwriting that pressed hardest when something mattered most. Every thread of accountability ran straight through his father's wife and through her straight through his father. There was no version of justice available to him that did not also wound the people he was bound by every obligation the institution placed on him to protect. He could not publish the letters, could not share what he had read, could not allow the words Diana had written in the belief that no one would ever read them to become the subject of the kind of public conversation that turns a private woman's private grief into something consumed and debated and reduced by the machinery of public attention. He could not even speak about what he had found in any forum that would be heard, because speaking about it meant naming people, and naming people meant doing exactly what the institution had decided in its careful arithmetic of consequences could not be done. What he could do, the one thing still within his power to give her, was this. He could keep her voice out of the system she had written in her own hand that she did not trust. He could refuse to return her private words to the archive that had failed on 3 separate occasions across 4 months to protect them. He could place them somewhere that he controlled in a building that had once been her home and hold them there. And that is what he chose. Not because it resolved anything, not because it answered the question of who had authorized those 3 withdrawals or what they had believed would happen when William opened the boot of that car. Not because it gave him anything that could honestly be called closure, a word that has always been somewhat inadequate to the reality of what it describes. He chose it because it was the only thing left to choose. Because in a story where every other option carried a consequence that extended well beyond him and beyond his grief and beyond any individual claim to justice, keeping his mother's letters in a safe in his own private sitting room was the one decision that answered to nothing except the simplest and most human obligation available to him. She had been his mother, these had been her words, and they would stay with him. Diana wrote in one of the letters William read that night that the most dangerous thing inside a royal household was never the conflict itself. It was the silence that settled over a conflict once everyone involved had collectively decided to pretend it had resolved itself. She wrote it in 1995. She pressed the pen harder at that sentence the way she always pressed harder when something needed the page to hold what she was saying. 30 years later, in a courtyard she had never stood in, those words had found their way back into the light. Not through any official channel, not through any sanctioned process, not through the careful managed disclosure that institutions prefer when the things they have been holding can no longer be held entirely. Through an unregistered car, a boot that sat lower than it should, a veteran guard who walked a slow circle and noticed what a less experienced man would have passed. That is how the truth tends to move inside closed institutions. Not dramatically, not through broken locks or forced entry, through the gaps, through the 11-day windows and the valid authorization codes and the roles left unfilled and the small questions asked at dinner tables that nobody in the room believes will amount to anything. And here is what the courtyard actually revealed beneath the access log, beneath the procedural failures, beneath the legal arithmetic, and the 15-minute conversation and the garden party, and the single word William said to a guest while an aide and a correspondent stood close enough to hear. Institutions are only as trustworthy as the silences they choose to keep, and only as strong as their willingness to examine those silences at the exact moment when the cost of examining them is highest. The British monarchy has understood this in one form or another for centuries. It has simply never found a comfortable way to say it aloud. Diana said it aloud. She wrote it down. She pressed the pen hard into the page, and she dated it, and she trusted that the paper would hold what she was saying, even if no person in the building around her would. And she was right. So, how does a story like this one actually end? The reforms are in place, the gap is closed. The case that sat in a courtyard with no clearance has been secured in a safe at Kensington Palace, and the formal machinery of the institution has moved through its full-cycle review, finding, recommendation, implementation, and arrived at the particular kind of resolution that institutions produce when they are managing a situation rather than resolving it. Everyone has returned to their positions. Charles in his, Camilla in hers. William in his carrying something he did not have 6 weeks ago and will carry for the rest of his life. Tom Parker Bowles in his the food writer, the restaurant critic, the son who came to see his mother on an ordinary Friday and left in a way that neither of them will ever fully walk back from. Sergeant Whitmore returned to his post at Clarence House the following Monday morning. He walked his usual slow circuit of the courtyard. He checked the expected plates. He did the work that a man with more than a decade of institutional knowledge does without drama and without announcement, because that is what the job requires. And because he is precisely the kind of person who understands at a cellular level that the job matters even when, especially when the consequences of doing it correctly turn out to be far larger than anything the job description anticipated. He flagged a car because the boot sat low. He held his position when asked to step aside. He did not fill the silence in the courtyard with urgency or speculation. He just held. And in holding, he opened a chain of events that ran backward 30 years and forward into a future none of the people in that courtyard had yet fully reckoned with. The question that nobody in that palace has answered, the question the story began with, and the question it ends with, is the one that sits just behind Tom's silence and just inside Camilla's careful, constructed response in that sitting room. If Tom only received those letters, and the access log confirms without ambiguity that he could not have taken them himself, then someone inside Camilla's personal household loaded that case. Someone who had spent years accumulating the kind of trust that grants access to the most protected materials in a royal collection. Someone who used that trust on 3 separate occasions to move a dead woman's private words out of the archive that held them. And what that person believed would happen when William opened the boot, whether they imagined containment or disclosure or something else entirely that has not yet surfaced in any account of what followed, is a question to which no public answer has been given. Some things get locked away precisely because they are too dangerous to destroy and too honest to be allowed to exist in the open. Diana wrote that too in her own way across the letters and the diaries and the documents she left behind, with the careful, deliberate thoroughness of a woman who understood that what she put on paper might one day need to speak without her. 30 years on, it still is. Subscribe if you want to be here when the next layer of this surfaces. Because stories like this one, stories built on gaps in the record and silences in the room and single words said quietly in a garden while aides and correspondents stand close enough to hear, do not end where they appear to. They simply pause. They wait for the next unregistered car, the next boot that sits too low, the next person whose instinct is good enough and whose nerve holds long enough to notice. And then they begin again.